Here's a guy who thinks that if atheism is true, our minds are as unreliable as AI.
AI slop is destroying more than just the internet. It is also destroying arguments for atheism. Hi, I'm Glenn from Speak Life, and we like to see all things through the lens of Jesus, including this topic of AI and how it resonates with a really cool argument against atheism.
It's the fawns of arguments against atheism.
Is AI slop killing YouTube? I think it's killing more than just YouTube. I think it's actually killing arguments for atheism. And maybe you know where I'm going already, but just think about it. We've got this intelligence, this artificial intelligence, that doesn't need to be right. It needs to appear right, because its goal is human attention, not the truth. Kurzgesagt are doing their best to have human fact checkers, and that will be a large part of how we respond to the challenge of AI slop. We want a higher intelligence than artificial intelligence, whose highest goal is to seek truth and not to simply appear like it's seeking truth so that it gets human attention. This resonates very strongly with an argument made by Alvin Plantinga, the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Let's have a look at Alvin Plantinga explaining this argument, and then I think we'll see the resonances.
The evolutionary argument against naturalism says that if our epistemic faculties are just the product of evolution, then they are shaped by natural selection in such a way as to get us to perceive the world and conceptualize it in a way that makes us better at surviving in it, rather than having accurate knowledge about it. Plantinga argues that since naturalism as an idea presumes itself to be a product of a cognitive system aimed at survival rather than accuracy, it undermines itself. However, the idea that naturalism is false, because a God exists who created our minds for the purpose of understanding truth, is self-reinforcing, because it follows from such an idea that said idea is the product of a mind designed by a God for the purpose of understanding truth.
I think if you accept naturalism and evolution, you can't think of your cognitive faculties as being reliable.
Given that we are clearly fallible, even if there is a God who created our minds for knowing truth, he obviously didn't create them to be 100% reliable. Even if there is a God, it is still clearly possible to become entirely convinced of entirely false ideas. Even if there is a God, you can't think of your cognitive faculties as being completely reliable. The question is whether the level of fallibility God built into our minds is greater or less than the level of fallibility evolution would produce if natural selection selects for survival rather than accurate perception. Plantinga thinks that the level of fallibility God built into our minds is probably less than the level of fallibility that would be produced by natural selection.
As giving you the actual truth about the world. And the argument goes like this. If you're a naturalist, you'll probably also be a materialist about human beings. You'll think that human beings are material objects. They're not souls, immaterial souls that have a body or own a body or work in a body or whatever. They are material objects.
Why would souls somehow be better at modeling a material world than a product of that material world? I'm not saying that souls couldn't be better at it, only that it's not clear why they would necessarily be.
The only thing that exists are material, physical objects, and nothing else exists.
Right. So if that's the case, then you'll be a materialist.
At which point, at best, our intelligence is machine-like. It is about material computation of information rather than a soul rationally ordering its thoughts.
This statement seems to assume that rationally ordering one's thoughts can only ever be done by a spooky, woo-woo ghost haunting your skull. Frank Turek likes to say that if your mind is simply physical activity in the brain, then you're not reasoning, you're just reacting. I don't understand why reasoning is not a kind of reaction. If I'm presented with a valid argument whose conclusion follows by logical necessity from its premises, recognizing that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises seems very much like a reaction to me. It doesn't seem like something a free will is doing. If an argument is in a valid form and I believe the premises to be true, I won't be able to help but believe that the conclusion is true because I wouldn't be able to understand what it would even mean for the conclusion to not be true. The whole reasoning process seems very mechanical to me, so I don't understand why a physical object couldn't carry it out.
And if you're now suppose we think about not ourselves, but about creatures on some alien planet that are a lot like us, maybe a planet revolving around Arcturus. So these creatures, let's suppose that for them, naturalism holds. As things stand for them, naturalism is true. And also that evolution holds. And also these people then are material objects. These beings, creatures are material objects. So what is it that causes their behavior? Well, what causes their behavior in a sort of proximate sense will be their neurology, the states in which their in which the brains are. So a bunch of neurons fire, send a signal down a nerve, let's say, to a muscle, causing it to contract, and my arm goes up. That's how behavior gets there, right?
How does that work in creatures with souls? How does an immaterial soul interface with our brains? And why is it that it only seems to be able to interface with the nerve cells in our brains and not the nerve cells in other people's brains, or even the nerve cells in other parts of our body?
So behavior is caused by their neurology and also their beliefs, what they believe, and the content of their beliefs. That's also caused by their neurology. Now, given that evolution is true, that these creatures have come to be by virtue of natural selection, winnowing some form of genetic variation, we can take it for granted that their behavior is adaptive. It enhances their fitness. It leads to survival and reproduction. And if that's true, then the same thing will go for what causes their behavior, namely their neurology. We can think of that too as being adaptive, causing the right kind of behavior, therefore being such as to promote survival and reproduction. Now, the neurology that causes their beliefs, that causes their behavior, also causes their beliefs.
If you look at the way our perceptions and cognition work, they do seem to function in ways that are more consistent with survival than obtaining truth. So even if there is a God who designed our minds, it seems as though God made our minds in such a way as to prioritize our ability to survive in the world over accurately perceiving it. Given that this is the case, why should we infer that our minds would be more likely to accurately perceive and conceptualize the world if they were created by a God who, just like natural selection, apparently built our minds to prioritize survival over attaining truth?
And now the question is, okay, suppose their behavior and their neurology is in fact adaptive. What about their beliefs? What about the truth of these beliefs? Well, I think you can see that it doesn't matter about the truth of these beliefs. If the neurology causes the right behavior, the adaptive behavior, what they believe makes no difference. The belief, you might say, floats along as an extra. There it is. They hold these beliefs. That's caused by the neurology. The neurology is adaptive, but the beliefs don't have to be true for the neurology to be adaptive. If the neurology causes false beliefs but causes the right behavior, makes no difference whatever.
And that seems to be the way our minds actually work, whether there's a God or not. You might say that our cognitive fallibility is the consequence of the fall when the first sin was committed. Well, if that's the case, you have even less reason to infer that our cognitive faculties are more accurate if they were created by a God, because even if God did design our minds for the purpose of attaining truth, that design was corrupted when Adam ate the fruit. So why should we be any more confident in our ability to discern what is true than if our brains are a product of natural selection?
Do you see, if our neurology, if just our brains are after adaptation, therefore we are just after survival and reproduction, then our behavior is really what counts, and that same brain that creates the behavior is also creating beliefs, but beliefs float free from any need for truthfulness. All we need to do is pass on our genes. That's really what our neurology, that's what our brains are adapted to do.
And if you look at how our minds work, how our perceptions work, that's what they look like they actually do. This is the case whether our minds were created by a God or not. If a God created our minds, it very much looks like he did so in such a way as to prioritize survival over discerning the truth, just like natural selection would.
The truthfulness of our beliefs at that stage is immaterial to what brains are actually intended to do. What brains are actually intended to do is to forward their own genes. It is human reproduction that is calling the tune, and truth can take the hindmost. Don't you see the parallel with AI? If AI is just after human attention, then that's what it will follow. That is its highest motivation, and fact checkers be damned. As long as it can fool enough humans to garner enough attention, then AI is doing its job. Unless, of course, you want to be like Kurzgesagt and you want to have good human intelligence that is higher than AI, that is constantly fact-checking and bringing it into alignment with a greater purpose called truth. But if AI requires that higher intelligence, how much more does human intelligence require a higher intelligence that prizes truth above mere survival and reproduction?
But given the way our minds work, that doesn't seem to be the case. Presumably an all-powerful, all-knowing God would be able to create us to be as infallible as he is, but he didn't. Or he allowed our minds to become fallible when Adam ate the fruit. Either way, even if naturalism is false, I don't see why we should infer that our minds are any less fallible than if naturalism is true.
Alvin Plantinga says, If your brain is purely the product of natural selection that is after passing on its genes, then you have no reason to accept its beliefs as being true.
And if your mind is designed by a god to prioritize passing on genes over discerning the truth, then you also have no reason to accept its beliefs as being true. Or if you believe that human epistemic fallibility is the product of the fall, then you also have no reason to accept its beliefs as being true. If you could accept your beliefs as being true, there would be no need for science. The whole point of science is to get around as many of the biases and fallibilities that are baked into our neurology as we can. This is the case regardless of whether those biases and fallibilities were baked in by natural selection or by God.
Such brains are not designed to create true beliefs. Such brains are designed to create behavior that is adaptive to passing on our genes.
And given the way it seems as though our brains work, that is the case whether they were created by a god or not.
Which means if a brain that has come about purely via natural selection happens to believe in naturalism, happens to believe in atheism, we have no reason to believe or trust that that brain is making a true statement.
Given that we are not infallible, even if there is a God, we still can't trust whether our brains are making true statements. Again, that is the whole reason we need to take a rigorous approach to our epistemology. If a perfect, all-powerful God created our minds for the purpose of discerning truth, and that ability was retained after the fall, we could just guess about how things in the world work, and those guesses would always be right.
That brain is just trying to pass on its genes. But I think just as Kurzgesagt wants to have a higher intelligence above AI that is fact-checking, so don't we all want to have a higher intelligence above mere human neurology that fact-checks us, that holds us to a higher standard of truth than merely survival and reproduction?
Not if it undermines my ability to survive. An implication of the evolutionary argument against naturalism is that knowing the truth is not necessarily better for your survival. If that's the case, why should I care about the truth so much?
Alvin Plantinga made famous his argument against naturalism long before we began running these experiments in what would happen if intelligence was simply geared at survival and reproduction. But now we are running the experiment. We are witnessing his thought experiments, not by going to a planet orbiting around Arcturus, but by noticing what AI does. And when AI is simply meant to spread itself around, and when this form of intelligence merely needs to appear right rather than be right, we all recognize there needs to be a higher intelligence to bring that intelligence to account. There needs to be a fact-checking. There needs to be truth above biological reality.
But given that we are fallible whether there is a God or not, and fallible in ways that very much seem to facilitate survival, I don't see how this argument makes a convincing case for such a God's existence.
But if you believe that about AI, then I think Alvin Plantinga, and certainly I, would encourage you to think of a higher intelligence above mere human neurology. And if you don't believe in a higher truth above your neurology, then you really have no right to claim that your atheism or your naturalism is itself true.
What I do have a right to claim is that it seems consistent with observation, which is what I care about most, and is something that isn't the case for the existence of the supernatural.
Your atheism at that point is on the level of AI slop.
This is a good analogy even if there is a God. Just as AI was designed by a higher intelligence to prioritize engagement rather than truth, if a God exists, he seems to have designed our minds to prioritize survival over truth. Another assumption that seems to be implied by this argument is that truth is the goal of science. I suspect science gets us closer to truth than any other epistemic method, but that isn't really the point. The point is to come up with models of the world that are consistent with observation. If all of our observations are illusory, then the models will not be true, but as long as the illusions behave consistently, those models will still work. Even if it turns out that we're in some kind of matrix and the way the universe actually looks is completely different, the scientific models we use will still have some kind of validity because we can still use them to effectively navigate the matrix. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.